Afghanistan has been a territory, region, and nation and state located in Central Asia between modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan. It has been known as the graveyard of empires and features rugged terrain such as the Hindu Kush mountain range between the Afghan-Pakistan border, which consists of large rocky peaks and very impassable terrain, especially during the winter months. Many campaigns attempted to conquer Afghanistan, leading to its nickname as the Graveyard of Empires. Those campaigns included the Persians, the Mongolians, the Greeks under the leadership of Alexander the Great, the Arab Caliphate, the British, as well as the Soviet Union in more modern history. We'll get to the US invasion of Afghanistan later. The modern history of Afghanistan is filled with multiple dynasties, different ruling states, invasions, uprisings, and attempts by outside forces to conquer the land. Following World War I, Emir Amanullah Khan declared the Emirate of Afghanistan a sovereign and independent state in 1919. After establishing diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and Germany's Weimar Republic, Khan declared himself King of Afghanistan in 1926 and established the Kingdom of Afghanistan. In 1928, another civil war broke out, followed by several tumultuous years until the 1964 Constitution was formed. Afghanistan remained neutral during World War II and was not aligned with either side of the Cold War. In 1973, Daoud Khan, the former prime minister, launched a bloodless coup while King Zahir was in Italy. Khan became the first president of Afghanistan and therefore abolished the monarchy. In April of 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in yet another coup against Daoud, triggering yet another civil war. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The 1979 invasion of Afghanistan triggered what was now called the Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviet Union crossed in, following several advisors being already in the country, trying to steer the country into a direction that was more amenable to the Soviet Union's interests. After the coup, the Soviet Union decided that the diplomatic solution no longer existed, and the main force army invaded Afghanistan. The ragtag forces of Afghanistan, comprised of no real standing army, was no match for the mighty and venerable Soviet army. The Soviets came in armed with tanks, attack helicopters, and several troops, including their Special Operations Division, the Spetsnaz. The Soviet Union utilized tactics that targeted civilians, as well as littering the landscape with various forms of landmines. The mighty Mi-24 Hind helicopters were decimating the Afghan civilian populace as well as the Mujahideen fighters who attempted to fight back against the Soviet invaders. The United States saw the Soviet-Afghan War as an opportunity to strike back against their Soviet adversaries. The United States and Pakistan began funneling in billions of dollars worth of cash and weapons into Afghanistan to aid the Mujahideen fighters in their battle against the Soviet Union. The American CIA funneled weapons into Afghanistan through Pakistan and sourced weapons from places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia to help disguise the fact that the United States was providing weapons to the Afghan fighters. Other weapons brought in to help the Mujahideen fighters in their fight against the Soviet invaders was the FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missile system. The Stinger is a man-portable surface-to-air heat-seeking missile system that proved to be very successful against the Russian jets and Mi-24 Hinds that had been decimating the Mujahideen fighters. It was these missile systems that helped turn the tide of the Soviet-Afghan War and helped the Mujahideen to push back the Soviet forces. Eventually, the war became a war of attrition, where the Soviet Union was dumping too much manpower and resources and money into the fight in Afghanistan that they could no longer sustain. And in 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, ending the Soviet-Afghan War.
Almost a decade of Soviet bloodshed and battle ended 5 minutes ahead of schedule as the Soviet Army completed its retreat.
Following the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan in February of 1989, coupled with the lack of material aid from the United States in rebuilding the country after nearly a decade of war, a power vacuum existed in the country. This soon would be filled by the Pakistani-backed Taliban, which would rise to power and rule over most of the country under a strict Sharia governance. The Taliban was born from the Islamic schools, or madrasas, established in the Pakistan-Afghan border region during the refugee crisis created by the war. These madrasas taught radical Islamic ideals and funneled new fighters into the country to fight off the Soviet menace. Many foreign fighters contributed to the furtherance of power for these Taliban fighters, including one who would rise to infamy following the war, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was born March 10, 1957, the son of a wealthy family that owned a large construction company in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden grew up with an education that would set him up to one day enter the family business. Bin Laden's furtherance in his Islamic studies led him to join the many foreign fighters headed to Afghanistan. Near the end of the Soviet-Afghan War, reportedly bin Laden met with several senior leaders of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and formed an international jihad organization that would later be named Al-Qaeda, or the Base. The purpose of the organization was to take up the cause of global jihad after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, which at the time was anticipated to occur soon. The first major occurrence for bin Laden to rise to prominence was when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia feared that Iraq would invade their nation next. Bin Laden offered the royal family his Mujahideen forces that were successful in Afghanistan to defend the kingdom. But the Saudis had a better offer: the mighty United States with over 700,000 troops and the backing of an international coalition. Following the end of the Gulf War and the liberation of Kuwait, the United States remained in some force in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden saw this as an affront to Islam, and it further angered him after the Saudis not only allowed infidels to fight to defend their holy land, but also to occupy the kingdom, home to two of the holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. Bin Laden's criticism of the Saudi monarchy led him to be placed under house arrest until his exile in 1991, where he fled to Sudan. Ultimately, his continued criticism of the royal family led to his being stripped of his Saudi citizenship and later being cut off from his family's wealth. After ties to the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and a failed attempt to assassinate Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, bin Laden would go back to Afghanistan, where he would issue a fatwa declaring war against the United States. Bin Laden would continue to grow his organization and establish training camps in Afghanistan for young jihadis to train in their fight against the West. Many terror attacks throughout the 1990s were purported to be planned and carried out under the leadership of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. In August of 1998, bin Laden and his second-in-command, Ayman al-Zawahiri, executed simultaneous bombings of U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in West Africa. This brought bin Laden and al-Zawahiri to the attention of the U.S. public for the first time. A few weeks later, President Clinton ordered a series of cruise missile strikes on al-Qaeda-linked targets in both Sudan and Afghanistan, and in June 1999, bin Laden was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Tuesday, September 11, 2001, the world changed. At 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time, American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew, departing from Boston bound for Los Angeles, was hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, also a Boeing 767, carrying 56 passengers and 9 crew, is flown into the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 carrying 58 passengers and 6 crew, crashes into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And at 10:03 a.m., United Flight 93, a 757 with 37 passengers and 7 crew, crashes near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. These attacks, orchestrated by al-Qaeda operatives under the command and control of Osama bin Laden, radically changed the world in U.S. foreign policy. 15 days following the 9/11 attack, U.S. Special Operators and CIA Special Activity Division operatives covertly infiltrate Afghanistan and join up with the Northern Alliance. On October 7, 2001, the U.S., along with a coalition including the United Kingdom, officially invades Afghanistan. For the next several months, U.S.-led forces conduct operations that effectively take out the Taliban control structure in the country. Bin Laden is on the run. Following operations in the Tora Bora region of Afghanistan, bin Laden is able to slip away into the Pakistan countryside. For the next 10 years, the war continues to rage in Afghanistan as International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF as the coalition in Afghanistan would be called, works to combat a growing insurgency. For several years, the coalition faces many wins and drawbacks against the threat of not only foreign fighters, but tenacious Taliban and militia fighters, led by many veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War. Operation Enduring Freedom sees attention drawn away in 2003 when the United States invades Iraq and ousts the brutal dictator Saddam Hussein. With conflict in two separate theaters and resources heavily divided, Afghanistan begins to slip away from the public knowledge and pick back up in 2007 as the need for more concentration of forces emerges. After seeing some success with the tactic in Iraq, a surge of troops is also attempted in Afghanistan. Then, momentum begins to pick back up on one fateful night in May of 2011.
Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda.
Despite the killing of Osama bin Laden, the war in Afghanistan continues for the next several years. As the Iraq conflict draws to a close and the rise of ISIS looms, Afghanistan continues to see more resources and activity deployed to the region. No end in sight was clear. And then in 2014, NATO announced the end of combat operations in Afghanistan. For the next several years, a handoff to Afghan forces sees a fragile situation threaten to result in the fall of Afghanistan. The U.S. attempts several times to broker an end to the fighting, sometimes even negotiating with the once-enemy Taliban. In 2021, the insurgency, led by the Taliban, increased considerably, culminating in the heavily criticized withdrawal of U.S. troops and allies from Afghanistan, pinpointed by the killing of 13 U.S. service members in an attack on Kabul, one of the deadliest days for U.S. forces in the 20-year war.
And now to a damning report on the chaotic end to America's longest war. The US State Department's review of the troop pullout from Afghanistan in 2021 finding key shortcomings that contributed to the swift Taliban takeover and frenzied evacuation scenes. It found fault with decisions made under President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, writing, quote, "During both administrations, there was insufficient senior level consideration of worst case scenarios and how quickly those might follow." And on the frantic evacuation effort once Kabul fell, the report says that it was hindered by the lack of a clear person in charge. It also says that clear decisions were not made ahead of time as to which Afghan allies would be airlifted out of the country.
The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2022 is one that has faced heavy criticism over the years and will continue to be subjected to critique and analysis. The now famous videos and photos of thousands of Afghan civilians attempting to board U.S. Air Force transport aircraft leaving Kabul airport highlight the disastrous nature of this hasty and poorly planned withdrawal. Further, the compromising of biometric data used by the U.S. and their allies to identify and catalog Afghan workers, police, military, and enemy combatants is another source of heavy criticism, as the Taliban now have a way to track and identify those who collaborated with coalition forces. This has led to a growing fear that civilians who worked with ISAF would be targeted for assassination by the Taliban. Another result of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is the role China plays in the future for the country, as they have negotiated several deals for energy development prior to and following the withdrawal of Western forces from the war-ravaged nation. This has global implications that reach far beyond just the region. The withdrawal once again proved the cyclical nature of history, as Charlie Wilson's quote about the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan in the 1980s became relevant once more.